Hey all, just 60 seconds before I get into the rankings here. This video is part of a longer audio podcast that can be found linked in the description. The podcast format this week includes more detail about scouting criteria and also includes my wide receiver rankings 8 through 15, which can also be found on this channel. On that note of production, this is still very much a work in progress, and so while anyone who has seen the earlier videos on this channel will know that this might be a step forward, this is by no means the final product. The audio is also something I will be fixing with better equipment here, possibly before the next show. If you do enjoy the content, do hit that like button as it helps with the growth of the show and can eventually in some way help with the production quality as well. With that said, on to the running backs. So to be clear, the only two running backs I have ranked are Trey Benson at number 1 and Jonathon Brooks at number 2. Though once again, I'm going to be starting at the back with number 10. So my running back 10 is Dylan Laube of New Hampshire. Dylan Laube is a player who got a lot of buzz in the Senior Bowl, including a report that he had the highest miles per hour time. He's a player who had a very good receiving profile in college, but he played for an FCS team and only played one game against the FBS. Now, for anyone who's a little unclear on these distinctions, that means he played at a college where the average team that he played was outside the top 130. And obviously farther than that too, but the point is that the FBS has over 130 teams, and Dylan Laube's team was not one of them. Dylan Laube is also a sixth-year senior, and while he does have many traits that you look for in terms of the first step, in terms of a downfield receiver, he does have some shorter arms, which is just something notable for someone you project as a receiving back. I did mention a couple shows ago that he plays in the slot some, but it's few and far between, but I think I was probably too harsh on that. In his final season, they did work him around the formation a good amount, and so it's worth giving him credit for that. That said, I still stick by the main point there, which is that the main concern I have when someone like this breaks out is that there's going to be natural comparisons to someone like Austin Ekeler. But I might be cherry picking, it's just Dylan Laube's worst games are not the kind of games that you saw from players like that. Austin Ekeler had 2,000 yards in a 10-game season. Dylan Laube had a little over 100 yards per game, but nowhere close to 200. And then he had at least 3 games with 9 targets and 31 or fewer receiving yards, and a fourth game with 7 targets and 37 receiving yards. Now, this is cherry picking a player's worst games, and I wouldn't do that on almost any level except for the FCS and except for a position like running back that is so physical. So while it is cherry picking a little bit and speaking towards specifically what he did the worst or his worst days, it's important to note that I really wouldn't expect a running back who you think has any even chance of being an Ekeler or Aaron Jones to be that bad in 4 games, frankly, against the FCS. Obviously, he doesn't have an FBS team himself around him, but it's still notable that at this physical position, you would just expect a little bit more. And then, if I didn't bring this up before, I don't have an age on Dylan Laube, but he is a 6th-year senior because he started for New Hampshire in 2018, or joined the football program in 2018. So that means he is probably one of the oldest running backs that I've ever evaluated. Up next at running back 9, Marshawn Lloyd, who has played at both USCs in his career, most recently at Southern California. Marshawn Lloyd is 2308 on my age scale, which makes him over 23 and a half at the start of the season. When I spoke before about excuses for what takes players to get to the NFL for so long, Marshawn Lloyd is a player who suffered a substantial knee injury early in his career. He was a top prospect before that point, and so this pedigree is important to note because one of the arguments that's been around Lloyd's head for the last few years, as he's not come out into the NFL but has continuously been a prospect people have talked about, is the idea that as he gets away from surgery, he might slowly improve. He is 217 pounds as of the Senior Bowl weigh-in, and so he checks a decent amount of boxes physically there as well. The big issue with Marshawn Lloyd is that while he was very efficient at Southern California, he was not necessarily great in terms of volume because he just wasn't allowed to be. In part, that is because USC rotates their running backs as part of their system, but it's still important to note that Marshawn Lloyd was held under 10 carries in 7 of 11 games. So Marshawn Lloyd is the player who has the pedigree, the potential to rise, and has at least been efficient, even if he hasn't been necessarily efficient at a high volume. And for these reasons, Marshawn Lloyd is my running back 9. Up next, at running back 8, potentially the most controversial name in my running back list based on where I have him ranked, Braylon Allen, the running back from Wisconsin. First, the most unique thing about Braylon Allen, and the thing that people seem to talk about the most, his age. Braylon Allen on my list is 20 years, 7 months as of September 1st, rounded to the nearest month. The youngest player before Braylon Allen was 20 years, 11 months, and no other player in this class is under 21 years. Aside from that, it's not just the age that Braylon Allen is now, it's the fact that Braylon Allen started, played significantly, and put up a huge year as a true freshman at Wisconsin, which would have made him 17, turning 18 in late January. That said, from the most basic analytical perspective, my biggest problem with Braylon Allen can be summed up by the fact that he had those big years, or at least that big year in his freshman year and a big year in his sophomore year as well, but he never really took a step forward. Compared to a 17-year-old or 18-year-old where the expectations are low, the season is spectacular. If you're just comparing it to the peak season you look for in a standard running back prospect, it doesn't really come up to standard. It's also worth noting that running backs in Wisconsin's history have not just had 1,200 yards and 12 touchdowns like Braylon Allen did, but 2,000 yards and 25 touchdowns. Guys like Monty Ball, Melvin Gordon, and Jonathon Taylor had these kind of numbers. From an archetype perspective, Braylon Allen is a player that I see as a pure two-down player at the next level. While he did get a lot more receptions this year, he was very unsuccessful on these plays. Early in the season, when they tried to feed him the ball a lot, he did catch most of the passes, but he did not have a lot of yards. And part of the problem is probably the transition to ball catcher to ball carrier. So because of that low success rate, Braylon Allen kind of becomes the quintessential example of what I said earlier. I understand why people like the fact that Braylon Allen catches passes, because theoretically you can look at that and say, okay, if someone is willing to give him 400 touches and 90 targets, he can catch them and get me 1 point per catch. But in a more realistic scenario, he's just not good enough at catching the ball to make a team want to let him do it. At least that is my read on how he played this year. The big example that Braylon Allen gets compared to, at least by fans, is Derrick Henry. But I think the big difference is that Derrick Henry very, very quickly builds up speed and power. I'm not sure Braylon Allen builds up speed and power as quickly. It's not that he's not powerful, it's not that he's not fast, but if he can't get to those speeds, if he can't get to that power level fast enough, he's more easily taken down. And aside from that, I find Braylon Allen doesn't have the little bits of wiggle or nuance in the open field that many of these other running backs do. I find a lot of these running backs do a lot better at manipulating angles and getting past defenders downfield. And while you can say Braylon Allen was extremely young and banged up during this season, and potentially maybe this would have been the year he had a breakout, Chez Mellusi was playing just about as well as Braylon Allen in those early games, and against Washington State, Braylon Allen was held to 7 carries for 20 yards and 13 touches for 32 yards early in the season. This is a Washington State run defense that, by the end of the season, gave up 150 rushing yards per game, so it wasn't as if they were a juggernaut on the season. Ultimately, Braylon Allen is a player that I'm almost scared to rank too much lower than this because of the fact that he is under 21 years old and because he's so significantly under 21 years old, and maybe this season would have been a peak season, or rather maybe next season would have been a peak season, and that should have been his junior year. But at the end of the day, without having seen the peak season yet, it's not something I'm willing to project on a player just because they had 1,212, because if Braylon Allen played one more year and never got past 1,212, all of a sudden he's just a player with a fairly mediocre peak season. So to recap where I'm at with the running backs so far, I have Dylan Laube at running back 10, Marshawn Lloyd at running back 9, and Braylon Allen at running back 8. Next up, the other player that I think is probably tied for most controversial on this list, running back 7, Blake Corum from Michigan. So right away, the two things that stick out with Blake Corum is that he is one of the older running backs on this list at 23 years, 9 months, and he is also overall someone that is probably seen as a fringe athlete. Speaking towards the overall beliefs I have at the position, with big traits being everything, being a fringe athlete is a very scary thing. It's a combination of size and his speed, which is solid, but ultimately not in the higher tier of the NFL level. I do think an interesting comparison for Blake Corum is kind of like a Kyron Williams, just because what made Kyron Williams so good last year was that he did every little thing right. And I think that's what Blake Corum gets so much credit for from some place like Michigan, because he hits the right holes most of the time, he takes care of the football, he's just a very assignment oriented player. At least that is my perception of the situation. That said, assignment football is generally not the thing that pushes value up. It's explosive plays and explosive passing plays. It's also worth noting that Blake Corum's 2023 was significantly worse than the two previous years, and maybe that is a return from an injury, and a lot of people excused it because of the high number of touchdowns. But when you just look at the fact that his yards per carry was 4.8 in 2023 and 6.2 between the previous 2 years, that aligns with what I was seeing in my own eyes, that he just did not have that many explosive plays this year. The big comparison, I think, physically that sticks out to me for Blake Corum, and I do actually think this might potentially be generous, is Devin Singletary. That said, if he can fit into that Devin Singletary mold, I could see him having that kind of impact and role at the next level, particularly as a 1A or 1B in a backfield like that. It's also worth noting that the Jim Harbaugh conversation is not just a joke. Now, to be clear, it is very unlikely to happen. It is a theoretical. But considering what all the things I just said about Blake Corum, needing someone to believe in him, I guess you could say Blake Corum needs someone to believe in him like Jim Harbaugh believed in him. So, yes, going to the Chargers would be a huge deal for Blake Corum's value. Now, to be clear, a 5th-round pick to the Chargers is not the same as a 2nd-round pick to somewhere else. You'd rather him drafted high than drafted to the Chargers. But if you can't pick where he's going to get drafted, you want him drafted to the Chargers. And so that's all I have on Blake Corum. Up next, my running back 6 on this list, Audric Estime of Notre Dame. What's really interesting about Audric Estime is that I almost feel like there's a Braylon Allen comp developing in my head, which is a weird thing to say. But I guess my point is that sometimes in fantasy it feels like we pay too much attention to an outlier just for the sake of being an outlier. And to respect Braylon Allen, again, it is crazy that he started in college football as young as he did. But Braylon Allen's age is a conversation that seems to come up all the time. But Audric Estime is the 3rd youngest player I've ever evaluated. Now, he is about 5 months older than Braylon Allen, but he is still incredibly young. He turns 21 around the time the season starts. He has a better peak season, 227 touches, 1,483 yards, 18 touchdowns. That's over 100 more yards and 6 more touchdowns than Braylon Allen's career highs. He has more wiggle and shake in the open field. He's a better missed forced tackle creator, according to myself, as well as numbers from PFF. So it's interesting to me that Braylon Allen gets all this consideration as this player who is young, big, physical, and could potentially be this bowling ball guy at the next level. Because Audric Estime to me, now obviously I don't love him because he's my running back 6 here. It's not like I think he's one of the best running back prospects I've ever seen. But I do think he's closer to what people think Braylon Allen is than Braylon Allen. He's a young player. He breaks tackles better. He's looser in the open field. I think he's a slightly better pass catcher too. So I don't have too much to add outside of that to Audric Estime. I don't think he has the game-changing speed or the natural pass catching, even though I think he's better than Braylon Allen. I don't think he's so natural at it that a team will, look towards him in a passing situation, at least by default. But he is a guy who has great size that can take a NFL workload. He's shown some really interesting things at the college level. He's just not the fastest guy or the most explosive bursty guy, and that is a big deal. But Audric Estime has enough tools to make him my running back 6. Before I get into my top 5 running backs on this video, I would like to encourage anyone who is enjoying the content to subscribe to the channel. I plan to continue making more content like this, so both knowing that you are enjoying the content and letting you know when I post more content like it in the future can help with the growth of the channel. With that said, on to my top 5 running backs. And so on that note, since we have 5 down, even though we did do a recap a couple running backs ago, I will once again go through the running backs really quickly with number 10, Dylan Laube, number 9, Marshawn Lloyd, number 8, Braylon Allen, number 7, Blake Corum, number 6, Audric Estime, and now number 5, Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving, 22 years old as of September 1st, and a very small running back. Now, the 190 that he gets listed at makes it sound like he's getting close to 200, but to my personal eye, the frame that he plays at on the football field, I just have a hard time believing that he should be considered a back close to 200 pounds. Now, to be fair, we have been seeing more and more often in the NFL that smaller running backs can translate. Last year, we had both Devon Achane and Keaton Mitchell, who were elite speed demons and very small running backs. However, it's that first thing that does give me just a little bit of pause with Bucky Irving. To be very, very clear, it is not that Bucky Irving is not fast. He is fast. He's very fast. But I'm not sure he's Keaton Mitchell and Devon Achane fast. And in that context, I do worry a little bit because of the smaller stature and size. And we did have smaller backs like Deuce Vaughn come out last year and have a landing spot that people were very intrigued by and ultimately do nothing at the end of the day. And then I think the biggest question with Bucky Irving is, can his missed tackles forced skill translate? Because Bucky Irving is one of the best broken tackle running backs that I've ever seen from a small stature. And so I want to look at that and take that and push him all the way up to potentially my running back 3. But I have a hard time seeing that translate because looking at a player like Achane, it's easy to say, this guy is faster than anybody, so I know he's going to be faster than anybody at the next level. But can you still break tackles at a small frame when everybody else is going to be bigger, faster, stronger? That is a hard thing to answer. That said, all these questions with Bucky Irving has kind of taken me away from one of the biggest things, which is that his reception total did jump up quite a bit, and he got up to 56 receptions this year, which is a really good number for a running back. So when you consider his natural pass catching development, the ability to add as a receiver, and the ability to be a broken tackles guy potentially, even at his size, now maybe he can't be that at the NFL, but just compared to guys his size, Bucky Irving is a very intriguing running back, and that is what gets him up to my running back 5. At running back 4, and I would have never believed that a near 25-year-old running back would have been here, Ray Davis from Kentucky. Ray Davis weighed in at a beefy 220 pounds at 5'8.5" at the Senior Bowl, meaning he checks some great size boxes. While it has taken me a little while to come around to Ray Davis is a player that is becoming one of my guys with Malik Washington. Not necessarily saying these are players that I believe will have success at the next level again, but players that I just seem to be really falling in love with, seem to be believing in the narratives surrounding their careers, why it took them so long to get to where they are, and looking at the peak seasons and the peak performances that they had and getting really excited by them. Ray Davis has what you might call a life that ESPN will talk about a lot. I don't want to get into it too much. It's on the Wikipedia page, but suffice to say, his first stop out of high school was to junior college. Now, the Vanderbilt change might have been a very good move in his 4th year, but he got injured in that key 4th year. So after the Vanderbilt injury year, he comes back for Vanderbilt and has a great season for a team that might be the hardest team to have a great season for in the entire college football landscape. Because Vanderbilt is not just a team that isn't a great football program, they're not a great football program in the SEC. That is a really tough place to play. He had 1,000 rushing yards at Vandy, and no other running back on his team had 200. It was also the best year Vanderbilt had for a number of years as they finished 5-7. Coming off this Vanderbilt year, he catches the eye of Kentucky and transfers over to Kentucky. Now, Kentucky isn't a much better situation in the SEC, but it is a better one. But the most notable thing is that there were players like returning wide receiver Berrien Brown, who's not yet eligible, and incoming quarterback Devin Leary, who had all the hype, or at least in my opinion, or at least from what I saw, had most of the hype coming into the year. But Ray Davis is the one who had it by the end. 1,452 total yards, 21 total touchdowns. Ray Davis was electric all season. Now, again, the big thing I do worry about with his age is that at a very physical position, he is much older than a lot of the players he's playing against. And that is a very relevant concern in my opinion, but it is still a great year overall. And again, a career of which the early years I find to be largely excused. It's also worth noting that over the last 2 years, he has had 62 receptions. So when you consider those 62 receptions combined with his 220 pounds, that's a very intriguing combination. So Ray Davis is almost 25 years old as of September, at least 3 months off of it in terms of my age list or the age that I have written down for my notes. But despite that, Ray Davis is my running back 4. And then last up on this list, the top player on my running back list, at least outside my top 2, my running back 3, Jalen Wright of Tennessee. Jalen Wright is one of the younger players on this list at 21 years, 5 months, and one of the younger players overall in my evaluations. With Jalen Wright, it is incredibly simple. I listed 2 traits to start this podcast, and in my opinion, Jalen Wright's burst is the best on this list. Maybe that's just my eye, maybe that's a mistake in grading from my perspective, but that is my opinion, and that is why I have him so high. One play in particular where this burst can be seen is the 75-yard touchdown run that starts and kicks off the very first play against Georgia this past year. It's not just the fact that he has a great touchdown or that he hits an open hole necessarily, for instance. It's that you can see both safeties, both number 22 and number 23, hesitate with their feet in ways that they think they'll be able to get away with. Maybe they're just having a bad day, but most likely the burst through the hole from Jalen Wright caught them off guard naturally, and that's how you see some of this manipulation of angle. Because ultimately, that's what you're trying to get out of the burst trait. You're trying to get players who manipulate angles or confuse defenders' angles because of how fast they get to a point. You want safeties, for instance, believing that they can get to you at a certain angle, but finding out quickly that they cannot. The biggest problem analytically with Jalen Wright's profile is that, kind of like I talked about earlier with Marshawn Lloyd, Tennessee runs a very rotational running back system. They do this because of the incredibly high pace of play, which is much higher than anything in the NFL. So when you're running up to the line, running the play, running back so quickly, running up to the line again, running the play so quickly again, and over and over and over again, running backs come in and out of the game a lot to make sure that they stay fresh. That said, at the SEC level, Jalen Wright had incredible numbers in terms of efficiency with 137 carries and over 1,000 yards at 1,013. He also chipped in 22 receptions, which shows a bit of a completion to his profile. This year, for the first time, the Senior Bowl was going to allow underclassmen, but unfortunately, Jalen Wright pulled out. That was an event I was really excited to see him in and compare him to some of these other players. I do believe that the Senior Bowl pullout was attributed to some kind of injury, but I'd like to believe that the NFL just likes this guy. Ultimately, I might be overrating the burst trait for Jalen Wright because of the lack of burst in this class, but at 210 pounds, even if he is a little bit lean, he has a lot of the things that I really look for in translatable running backs at this stage of the NFL game and at the NFL level. So because of the traits I look for, Jalen Wright is my running back 3. And so, to recap my top 10 running backs for the first time on this show: running back 1, Trey Benson; running back 2, Jonathon Brooks; running back 3, Jalen Wright; running back 4, Ray Davis; running back 5, Bucky Irving; running back 6, Audric Estime; running back 7, Blake Corum; running back 8, Braylon Allen; running back 9, Marshawn Lloyd; and running back 10, Dylan Laube. So I do have a couple more running back mentions, just like I had on the wide receiver list. So to get to the guy I want to like the most, that is Rasheen Ali. I really fell in love with his 2021 tape quite a while ago. Great receiving work on that tape. Had some explosive plays even in the kick return game, but he just has not been able to get on the field consistently since then, and his downs have been frankly just more often than his ups. He was also at the Senior Bowl and he tore his bicep, which just continues this narrative. The downs are coming more often than the ups. So I feel like I can't sign off on a player based on basically liking his season from 2 years ago in college, but Rasheen Ali is a player I am still watching out for. The next 3 players on the honorable mention list are Blake Watson, Cody Schrader, and Will Shipley. These are 3 more players that I think could have success at the next level at frankly all facets of the game. I'm just not particularly high on their ability to do any one thing in particular, I guess. You know, they all showcase different roles and abilities, and things that are intriguing, and I wouldn't mind getting them on my NFL team, but I just can't find the thing to set them apart right now. And then I also have a trio of running backs from lower level schools that I frankly just haven't watched enough yet, and maybe I won't even. Maybe I'll let draft capital tell me, unless people really start talking about a couple of these guys. The two main ones are Jaden Jordan and Isaiah Davis from the FCS level, as well as Kamani Vidal from Troy. And with those final mentions, the running back ranks for this podcast are at an end. So that's all I have for the show today. If you did enjoy the content and have not liked the video yet, I would again encourage you to do so, or alternatively, to leave a comment and let me know how you think I'm doing. I do hope the production will steadily improve. It looks like next week it's probably going to be a deeper dive into wide receivers around the 4-7 range, possibly even re-ranking them. Who knows how it'll end up, but those 4 through 7 will be Keon Coleman, Troy Franklin, A.D. Mitchell, Brian Thomas Jr. Those are the 4. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the content this week, and I hope to bring you a bit more of it soon as well. Take care.